ahead and get started. My name is Carrie Morrison. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're very excited to have this event in defense of public education. This is my brainchild along with Jessica's after a school board meeting that we attended here in Coeur d'Alene back in August. And we decided that this was a very relevant, timely discussion to have, especially with November elections coming up. And these are going to be some very critical elections. We selected 4 panelists to join us this evening, all of whom are stakeholders in education. They will have a chance to introduce themselves very shortly. But first, I'm Carrie Morrison. I am a Coeur d'Alene native. I'm actually a graduate of Lake City High School. So I attended public school here in Coeur d'Alene for 7 years. I was in private school all throughout elementary school. So I kind of had experiences in both and have had the benefits of both, but am very much a supporter of public education for all. So I want to give Jessica, who is the founder of Civic Engagement Alliance, a chance to introduce herself, talk a little bit about CEA. So Jessica, go ahead and take it away when you're ready. And if you want, I can continue admitting people as they come in. I'll go ahead and do that for you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Yeah. And my name is Jessica Mahurin, and I am the lead organizer and founder of the Civic Engagement Alliance. Our mission is to generate grassroots community engagement for the common good. We organize nonpartisan efforts to encourage active participation in both civic and community life. Right now, what we're doing is that we are raising awareness to vote local for city councils, school boards, and fire districts in Kootenai County for the November 2nd election. Tonight's forum is a featured event of our Vote Local 2021 campaign as an opportunity to learn more about the issues impacting public education. Local public school boards are on the November 2nd ballot. Much of what we will discuss tonight directly relates to the decisions made on the school board level, and the decisions voters make will have long-term ripple effects throughout our community. Every vote matters. We are here to engage and educate, to drive and inform voting for responsible local leadership. Our volunteers have just recently sent out over 5,200 voting reminder postcards. And starting this week until early voting, we will canvass neighborhoods with educational get out the vote door hangers. We are still accepting volunteer signups if anyone's interested. We encourage all eligible local voters to ensure they are vote ready and take the time to research their ballot options before they vote. Local elections can be challenging, but we are here to help. We now have a local voter resources portal that is available on our website, and I'll put that link in the chat here momentarily, and that's at www.civicengagecda.com/voter guide. You also can sign up on our website as well to volunteer. I would also like to take an opportunity. The other hat that I wear is that I am an organizer and administrator of the North Idaho Pride Alliance. North Idaho Pride Alliance is a volunteer organization of LGBTQI people, community groups, and allies working together to create a more inclusive North Idaho through educating, advocating, and networking. It is in our position that the LGBTQI community and their loved ones are stakeholders in public education. We work to support LGBTQ youth by referring resources, organizing programs, fostering community partnerships to address needs, and advocating when called upon. While our organization has never directly interfaced with our local K-12 schools, we are paying attention to anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and actions, including the harmful targeting of affirming educational professionals, human rights and GSA clubs, calls to remove library materials, and incidents of bullying and discrimination that we are informed of. Every young person deserves love, care, and support. Unfortunately, for the LGBTQI community, not all households are equipped to provide the affirming care our young people need. A study by the Trevor Project shows that just one accepting adult can reduce the risk of a suicide attempt by 40%. That one accepting adult in a young person's life may be a school counselor or a teacher. LGBTQ young people are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBTQ youth. In our area, there are little to no resources available to help homeless LGBTQ youth. Our public schools often are on the front lines of societal issues and may encounter youth homelessness and food insecurity that impact a young person's ability to learn and stay in school. Research shows that LGBTQ students who attend schools with a curriculum that is inclusive of LGBTQ people, history, and events experience a better school climate and improved academic outcomes. Curriculum serves as a mirror when it reflects individuals and their experiences back to themselves. At the same time, curriculum serves as a window when it introduces and provides the opportunity to understand the experiences and perspectives of those who possess different identities. An inclusive curriculum should be balanced and include diverse windows and mirrors for every student. Our board of directors is concerned that with pressures to erase any sign of LGBTQI youth support in our schools, educational environments in Idaho may become less safe and inclusive. The door is always open at North Idaho Pride Alliance for us to connect community members with resources. Our LGBTQ resources can be found at www.nipridealliance.com. And I'll put that in the chat as well. And again, thank you so much for being here. I will be now in the background, so definitely feel free if you have questions during the panel, just put it in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Jessica. Okay, so just a little brief overview of our discussion topic. This is in defense of public education. So we are going to be talking about public education in Idaho and the challenges it's facing in these unprecedented times. There are many of those challenges. We have 4 panelists, as I mentioned earlier, who are going to be asked a series of questions, which we compiled, after which point questions submitted by you, the audience, in the Q&A will be selected, to which the panelists can also respond. All attendees are asked to be muted. Keep yourselves on mute throughout this discussion. But you are encouraged to submit comments in the chat or questions in Q&A, which brings me to our community guidelines that I want to go over real quickly. First of all, listen to understand, show respect and suspend judgment. We are here to understand the perspectives of others. Look for areas of agreement or shared values that may arise, and take an interest in the differing beliefs and opinions of others. If you'd like to submit a question, again, please be purposeful, to the point, and meaningful in your contribution. Any offensive, vulgar, or abusive language or behavior will not be tolerated. Anyone engaging in this behavior will be eliminated from this discussion and not permitted re-entry. We reserve the right to determine what behavior qualifies as offensive, vulgar, or abusive, as we are the ones hosting this event. I hate to have to point that out to anybody, but in light of recent events, behavior that we've seen at school board meetings and other such events like that, I do have to remind people just to maintain civility throughout all of this. We are here to better understand what is going on in education from these wonderful panelists that we have, whom I would now love to have introduce themselves to you. So panelists, if you could please introduce yourself and how you're a stakeholder in education in our community or state. Please try and limit yourself to about 3-ish minutes so we can get started on questions as soon as possible. Carrie, I will have you go first.
Okay, thank you. I am Carrie Cederquist. I'm the Community Impact Director for United Way of North Idaho. I have a bachelor's in anthropology, but over the last 10 years, I've worked in the nonprofit sector. Interested in how policy, systems, and environment interface with individual and social psychology. And so at United Way, what that looks like is looking through a lens of how access to education, financial stability, and health are the building blocks to a good quality of life. United Way of North Idaho started an early care education focus, starting by looking at school readiness as a pressing need and an unmet need in our community. And we started with running a Ready for Kindergarten program, which is a parent empowerment program. We started that in 2014. It's been ongoing since up until 2020 when the pandemic put a pause on that for us. But that program is all about empowering parents and caregivers to succeed in their role as a child's first, most loved, and most important teacher. Starting in 2016, we deepened our focus to from birth to 5, and understanding how access to quality childcare for working families is truly a 2-generational and multi-system issue that affects families, schools, businesses, and the community's long-term health. So at United Way now, we have a sort of 3-legged stool when it comes to early care and education. We focus our work on supporting families directly and increasing their access to affordable and high quality care, whether that is outside the home or as in the home with the parent as the teacher. We focus on strengthening childcare provider infrastructure, and then also building public and private partnerships to improve our early care systems. And I'm personally also a stakeholder. I have a 7-year-old son who, from about 3 months of age, I have relied on some sort of outside care, and every situation you could imagine, from a one-on-one nanny situation to a home-based small group care, childcare center, family members, half-day preschool and kindergarten, and now thankfully he is in public school. So thank you.
Derek, why don't you go ahead and go next? Thanks so much, Carrie.
Hi, I'm Derek Kolas, and I'm a teacher at Lake City High School. I've taught social studies and English for the past 30+ years. I started my career in Southern California at a private college prep school, and then got promoted to the Juvenile Detention Center here in Coeur d'Alene, where I did a 7-year sentence. Then I moved over to Lake City in 2000. And have been there for since that time. And I've taught basic education, basic English, social studies. I also did a stint at Project Night School, which has become Venture, the alternative high school. I've taught AP, US history. I've taught in the IB program, and I'm a committed professional educator for all of my career. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. He was actually my teacher at Lake City High School, so I'm very excited to have Derek here. Let's go to Luke next. I'm literally going in alphabetical order. So Luke, you're up.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you, Jessica, for all the organizing that you both do and for everything else you do for the community. My name is Luke Mayville. I'm a co-founder of Reclaim Idaho. We became somewhat known around the state originally when we got going in 2017 and 2018 around the issue of Medicaid expansion, which was a campaign that I will just quickly say no one played a bigger role in Kootenai County than Jessica Mihuron. So thank you, Jessica, for all the work that you've done on the healthcare issue. That was a campaign that won statewide, and that resulted in over 9,000 residents of Kootenai County getting healthcare as a result, and over 100,000 statewide. But I bring that up because that's not actually, a lot of people don't know this, but that's not actually how our organization began. We actually started around the issue of public education. We started in March of 2017 when a small team of us as volunteers got together in our hometown of Sandpoint and organized around a school levy for the passage of a levy. And we got excited by the success of our grassroots effort. And most importantly, we got excited by how many people were willing to show up and join in the work. And that inspired us with the idea that maybe we should try to build something similar on a statewide scale. And that's what led us to launch Reclaim Idaho and the Medicaid expansion campaign. But this past bit of time, we have gone back to our roots and launched a second big initiative campaign. And that is around public education. It's around, it's an initiative called the Quality Education Act that would secure over $300 million annually for basic K-12 expenses, mainly more funding for programs ranging from career technical education to full-day kindergarten to arts and music in rural districts where those programs have been entirely cut oftentimes. And then also the second big category that that the initiative would fund, which I know is dear to many people in Kootenai County, is better pay for both teachers and support staff, so that the amount of money that we're offering is more competitive. It's never, we're probably never going to match Washington State, but we can be a little bit more competitive than where we are currently. And that's critical for our kids, because if we don't pay competitive salaries to teachers, we're not going to have experienced, qualified teachers in front of our kids. I'll just say really quickly, our initiative, if we're successful at getting it on the ballot, it will go up for the November 2022 election. And you can learn more about that at reclaimidaho.org. Regarding the upcoming election on November 2nd of this year, I just want to say, as someone who's worked on the school levy before in my local community, I've been really impressed by the work of Citizens for Post Falls Schools. If you look them up on Facebook, you can follow them. And they did amazing work to pass the redo of the levy back, earlier this year. And now they're working really hard to, get out the vote for the school board elections. And they have endorsed the following candidates: Neil Uhrig of Zone 1, Bridget Malik of Zone 4, Jacob Dawson of Zone 5. I'm very, trusting of the work that Citizens for Post Falls Schools have done, and I encourage everyone to watch their social media feed, like them on Facebook, and everything else. And looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Luke. Really looking forward to full day kindergarten, as my son is in pre-K right now and we are paying an obscene amount for tuition. So I would really love full day kindergarten. Bring it on. All right, Brian, go for it.
Well, thank you. My name is Brian Segwin. I'm a Public Services Collection Development Librarian with North Idaho College. I have been a resident of North Idaho for 30 years now, and graduated from Priest River Lamont High School and was a first generation student at North Idaho College in the 90s. So we moved from here, my wife and I, to the Bay Area, and we were in the Bay Area for about 15 years. I got my undergrad in graphic design there and my master's in library and information science there as well. So I worked in a number of small academic libraries. I've been in education for all of my professional career. And in addition to my role at the library, I also serve on several committees, including the American Indian Advisory Committee, Common Read Program. I chair the Diversity Council and participate in the NAEP IDI Inclusive Excellence Group. So I'm a self-described generalist. I embrace the core values of librarianship, which is lifelong learning. That's why I'm really excited to participate in this panel, to learn from you all. And I thoroughly enjoy working in academics and helping students achieve their academic and career goals. Just personally, avid jogger. I have 2 children in the Coeur d'Alene public school system. And I think for the upcoming election, I'm just looking to vote for candidates who are going to demonstrate a strong grasp of the challenges facing our community, and I'll be looking to the collective for help in solving those problems. During the candidate forums this week, I especially appreciated Kiki Miller's response to a question about human rights and how the Coeur d'Alene area is addressing those. Her response was very practical, congratulating the city on its accomplishments, but also noting that there's a lot of work left to do, as opposed to, I think, just kind of falling back on, area exceptionalism. So, and lastly, I will just say that I always share this with students, that librarians love to share information and resources. And I always tell them to let me know when you've heard enough. So that is true of tonight. If you've heard enough, just say, oh, we're good, Brian, no more. All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. So much going on at NIC these days. We'll touch on that surely at some point in this discussion. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started with the initial questions. Again, I saw a few people come in during the introductions. Just a gentle reminder, let's be sure to keep ourselves on mute just so there's no feedback while our panelists are responding to the questions. I appreciate that so much. And feel free to turn on your camera or keep it off, whatever you would like to do, but this is being recorded. Okay, so we will go ahead and start with question number 1 here. There is a little bit of context to each one of these questions, and some of them are 2-part questions. So if you need a repeat, just let me know. So first is, Idaho is one of only 4 states in the US, one of only 4 states that does not allocate funds for early childhood education. $6 million in federal funds for early childhood education was turned down earlier this year by the Idaho legislature, largely over concerns of the indoctrination of children in leftist ideologies. If any of you would like to fact check that, you certainly can. There are plenty of sources out there. So the first part of this question is there a reason to believe that indoctrination is occurring or would occur at the preschool or pre-K levels? And the second part of the question is, how is this lack of funding affecting children and families in Idaho? And I'm going to go ahead and start with Carrie Cederquist on this one. I'm going to point to you since this is directly in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, thank you. I was more attentive to the legislative session this past season than I ever have been. And I think that's how people watch sports. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. So one thing that is important to establish just off the top is that children are learning continuously from the moment that they're born. So what we call early care, childcare, daycare is early education. It's not sitting at desks, skilling and drilling the alphabet. It is learning through play and through nurturing relationships with caregivers. And so I'll share examples of that throughout with the questions that I'll have the opportunity to answer. But I wanted to just set the scene for that. And then I would also concede that if youth are being persuaded to think politically one way or the other, that is a concern. However, there was significant misinformation that was shared with legislators that drew enough pause for a vote to happen. So to give a little background, in 2019, Idaho was awarded a $3.3 million grant from the Federal Preschool Development Grant program to fund local collaborations in conducting needs assessments for early education. United Way was one of those local collaboratives, one of, I think, 16 to receive funds to conduct assessments and develop strategic plans in Bonner and Kootenai counties. The conclusion that we came up with based on our local collaborations, so that's drawn from citizens who are working in early care, from businesses, from parents, just a pretty broad spectrum there. So this is all locally driven, again, so the conclusion with this was after decades of underfunding, our early childhood systems have severe fractures that lead to poor outcomes for children, their families, schools, communities. And the strategic plans addressed the need to increase the number of high quality childcare seats. It addressed the need to increase professional development for providers, especially in the areas of special education. The strategic plan outlined recommendations to continue childcare scholarship support to working families, because the gap between what parents can afford and what providers need to charge is much bigger than what many of us, about half of us in the community, can reasonably afford. Also covered strengthening childcare businesses, providing tools for parents to succeed in their role as a child's first teacher, and creating pathways for employer-supported childcare. So that is the background and context of the PDG, a preschool development grant. In January 2021, Idaho was awarded a second grant of $6 million from the PDG program. Now it needed to go through a budget allocation through the State Department of Education because of some of the terminology in there. And so this grant would provide 3 years of funding to local collaborations across the state to begin implementing them. So I will say again, these programs are locally led and shaped. So decisions about how these programs are run, such as curriculum, are decided by our North Idaho community members. It is important to note that Idaho has very minimal licensing standards for early education providers. There's no required curriculum period for any providers, either before or after the PDG. So there are, however, early learning guidelines and opt-in quality improvement programs. But some of the misinformation claimed that providers would be using books from a suggested, not required, reading list posted on the National Association for the Education of Young Children's website, and found and took screenshots of titles like A is for Advocacy, How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby, and found those to be really incendiary. So first of all, the point of this is that required curriculum is specifically and intentionally not part of that grant or what would have been implemented with that grant. And second, any curriculum that's implemented in a childcare setting is at the sole discretion of the director. So from our perspective and from working on this with local collaborations, and I can speak from the perspective solely of our Kootenai and Bonner County collaboratives, and that's the intent and the design of this statewide initiative, that any indoctrination is not happening. And frankly, that would be quite a big ask of our childcare providers who are already stretched very, very thin to provide basic levels of care, and many of which have trouble finding the resources to implement any type of curriculum. And once we get down a little bit further to speaking about some of the concerns about DEI and social emotional learning and critical race theory, I can share a little bit more of examples of what that looks like and feels like in a pre-K setting that can add some context. But then to the second part of the question, the lack of funding means fewer scholarships for families. To date, in the last year, we've allocated over $100,000 and to about 80 families in the region who earn too much to qualify for public assistance, but not enough to afford their childcare, which means that they have to make really difficult choices about what bills they're going to pay, or if they're going to lose hours at work, or if they're going to have a neighbor watch a child, or, I mean, there's just these zero-sum decisions. It means the lack of funding also means a staffing shortage in childcare, which again means fewer spots are available for families. It's also increased turnover in childcare providers. They make some of the lowest wages in society with a median wage of $10 an hour. So that disrupts children's learning and safe attachment when there is a lot of turnover. It means lower quality programs. And in my opinion, it sent a message that Idaho's children and childcare providers are not a priority, when in fact, childcare is essential infrastructure in our society, just as much as highways and healthcare and sewage. But I don't want to equate children with sewage. That was bad to end on.
No one got that from what you were saying. I just want to insert here real quick because I want to give anybody else on the panel a chance to respond to this question too. But when I first put my son into childcare back in 2017, we were paying, I'm going to be completely transparent here, we were paying $440 a month. And now we are paying, in 2021, 4 years later, $615 a month. And that's actually, compared to other states out there, I get that that's on the cheaper end. Some people would think, oh my gosh, that sounds great, because I've seen what other people in other states are paying too. But still, in this area, that is a lot of money considering inflation and then wages comparatively to inflation. So if anybody else wants to chime in here, please feel free.
I'd like to chime in, Carrie. And I just want to reiterate Carrie's point that when the Idaho legislature turned down a $6+ million grant from the federal government, granted, by the way, by the Trump administration, when the Idaho legislature turned that down, yes, they did send a signal that children are not a priority. And I just want to add to that something that we should all keep in mind. That was a signal that children are not a priority for them. There is no evidence that children are not a priority for the people of Idaho, for the vast majority of the people of Idaho. And that's something that's always really important to keep in mind, because you can get really, it can seem even gloomier and more depressing than it already is if you don't just, despair over the failures of the legislature, but you also start thinking that your neighbors think the way that the legislators do. In fact, they don't. I'm not saying that people all agree about education. I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of people that might be concerned about this or that book being taught. There certainly are. But I am certain, especially from thousands of conversations I've had in the last few months with voters about education, including about things like critical race theory, that it's very common that people will voice those concerns and still want their schools to be funded. Those two things are not inconsistent with one another. And I have no doubt that if you put directly, and I specialize in trying to put things on the ballot. I have no doubt that if you put a federal grant from the Trump administration for pre-K funding on the ballot, with or without the possibility of maybe a book that might offend someone being thrown into the mix, that 80% of Idaho would agree or would want that funding. No question in my mind. So don't despair, everyone. There's a lot of evidence out there, including polling on the pre-K issue, telling us that the vast majority of Idahoans do want state funding and certainly federal funding for pre-K.
Brian, you don't have to raise your hand. You just go for it.
Yeah, I would like to speak to the first part of this, and specifically the indoctrination. And again, I think this is a term that really probably took on new meaning. I mean, traditionally, throughout the centuries has just equated to teaching. And in the mid 20th century, you saw more of a critical look at it, and specifically through the lens of, is this teaching being paired with political ideologies or scholarly ideologies? And I think one of the things that it's really examined through today is just the intent, right? The intent of the material and what is shared, and if there's some direct correlation to behaviors and outcomes as a result of that, right? What I really appreciated was at the public forum in early September was Dr. Michael Nelson, Director of Assessment and System Performance at the Coeur d'Alene School District, basically just kind of reiterated what the equity framework, because there were questions around that, and in regards to critical race theory and pushing a particular agenda. And he basically, just paraphrasing, said his response was through the lens of social and emotional learning, and that just being essentially teaching kindergartners how to self-regulate, be kind to one another, and make good choices. And these are all things that we would obviously teach them in the home, and that we are just reinforcing it in the classroom as educators. So that was the one comment that stood out to me in some of these public forums that I participated in.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question here. So, speaking of spending, Idaho ranks 51st in per pupil spending as of the 2019 fiscal year, according to the US Census Bureau. So the question here is, why do you believe this is the case, and what efforts, if any, and by whom, are being made to improve the situation? And we can talk about more than just per pupil spending as well. We can talk about teacher salaries, but that number, wow, 51st. So Derek, you look like you want to speak on that. Take it away.
Thank you. We are very good at being at the bottom or at the top, depending on how you rank your list. We have a very conservative legislature, which has helped our state in a number of ways. I'm gonna toe the middle line here. I'm a fiscal conservative myself, but if you're waiting to increase funding for education for a rainy day, or you're waiting for the clouds to open and to be showered with money, that happened last year. We refused money. We gave a tax credit to Idaho taxpayers. We did a bait and switch on funding for local school districts. And we have, as Luke said, incredible community support for our local school districts. The Coeur d'Alene School District budget is funded by local dollars to the tune of 25%. 25% of the school district budget comes from our local levy, and that's every 2 years. We are very fortunate to be relatively wealthy. When you compare Coeur d'Alene School District to other smaller school districts around the state, the funding disparities possible through local levies are enormous. The disparity between a district like Coeur d'Alene and a small rural district like Mullen or Wallace may be a factor of 10 times the tax dollars that can be brought in to those districts. The fundamental problem here is that our state legislature has a mandate to provide thorough and equitable education for all students in Idaho, and they're pushing the fiscal responsibility for funding that down to local communities creates inequity. Those communities, even all the communities in Idaho, as Luke said very well, people want to support their kids and their educators and their educational system. I think his group has done some excellent work. The levy committees that work in local communities have done incredible work helping to gain funding. But our legislators do not prioritize education funding. We've had a huge amount of money come to the state in the form of aid as a result of the pandemic. And that money has, to some extent, gotten to local school districts, but nowhere near on the scale to help remedy some of these inequities. I don't know whether we're going to get out of being 51st on school funding, per student funding. We have fallen in the past 10 years from 45th, which none of us were terribly proud of either. But I think there are some groups and some individuals like this organization, Reclaim Idaho, and others that are making a good case for us, for the quality of education that we provide in Idaho. Because when you look at the quality that we do provide, we're middle of the pack in most subject areas, in spite of being at the very bottom in terms of per pupil funding.
And I know that Luke wants to jump in there, but I'm just going to put in the chat a link to a news article, folks. This just came out like a few days ago, how an East Idaho school district had to shut down its doors like a few days ago because of lack of available teachers and substitute teachers. This just happened. I'm going to drop that in the chat. Luke, go on.
Well, and Carrie, that happened in Filer as well. I'm not sure if that's the same district that you're mentioning. And they explicitly mentioned in the article that I read that it was not just due to COVID. It wasn't just because of COVID. It was because they just weren't able to attract and recruit both teachers and support staff. And we know, and I'd like to say more about this point, we know money isn't the only thing that matters when we are talking about recruitment, but we also know it is a big part of it, right? Now, I want to make the one point at least is that, you can get cynical about Idaho being dead last out of 50 states plus Washington, D.C., dead last in per pupil funding. And you can kind of say, well, it's Idaho. Hasn't it pretty much always been that way? Well, as Derek pointed out, no. As early as 10 years ago, it was closer to 45th. And then by some measures, if you go back even further, we were even lower. We were higher up than that. Now, I would highly recommend that if you're interested in really digging into some of these numbers and you want evidence for this, look at the recent reports put out by the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. They've been reporting on this for about a decade now. but just a couple years ago, they put out a report, the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, where they ask, okay, what portion of Idaho's total economy are we investing in education? Because that's the right measure. It's not just the raw number, because the raw number doesn't take into account that Idaho is one of the fastest growing states in the nation. So we could be increasing the amount of money we put in education, but if we're not increasing it enough, then we're not even growing at the pace of our population growth, and not to mention inflation. So you ought to ask, what portion of our total economy are we investing in education? Well, the answer is that 10 years ago, we invested about 4%. Now we invest 3%. And in case you don't think that that's a big deal, that is 1/4. That is that's 25% of the funding gone. So another way to put it, I like to try to put things in a little bit more, emotional terms. We as a state, we care, it seems, about our kids about 3/4 as much as we used to. We invest in them about 3/4 as much as we used to, 75% as much as we used to, and that's a tragedy. That shouldn't be tolerable to anyone. And the last point I want to make right now is that we've got to dispel the myth that funding doesn't matter. You hear all the time. I don't hear this much when I just go out and knock on doors and talk to people, but I hear it on social media a lot, that it doesn't really matter if we're 51st, because after all, we're like 25th when it comes to certain test scores. So we're still getting a lot for our money is what is said. Well, two things to that. One, that's actually not true if you look at the least well-funded districts. So if you take out the best funded districts, like Derek was mentioning, the Coeur d'Alene district, for example, is somewhat better funded. It's still not as well funded probably as it should be. But you take out, say, the Sun Valley area and the Boise district and a handful of other districts around the state, and you look at the really poorly funded rural districts, those districts don't get good test scores generally. But the more important point than that is that test scores are not even the most important indicator at all of whether we're providing a quality education to our kids. All of the research points in the direction of saying that if there's one thing we can do for kids to ensure a quality education, it's putting in front of them experienced, qualified teachers. And right now, talk about a tragedy, right? You can go over the border from Kootenai County and get paid $20,000 more per year. And ever since I've been thinking about this issue, I come across one person after another who has done just that, including people I grew up with. They taught for a little while in one of the Idaho districts, and then they left after 1 or 2 years and they went to a different state. And that's not the only problem. They're also going to other professions, especially in this era we're living through, where there's a lot of wage inflation in other professions. People are getting paid more in other areas, so they're leaving teaching to go into that. And we don't even have to get into the bus drivers and support and all the other support staff who are leaving our schools. So money doesn't make all the difference, but it makes an enormous difference, and it especially it makes a big difference when you talk about whether we're putting qualified, experienced people in front of our kids, which is, other than maybe whether or not a student lives in poverty in the home, the issue of whether or not you put qualified, experienced people in front of them in school is the single most important thing. That's what the research tells us.
I'm going to jump in here and just basically back to the first question, how does the lack of funding, and Carrie can probably tell us more about this in more detail than I can, but we have a saying in education that kids in trouble are kids with troubles. And when kids have troubles, it comes from all the factors in their lives. Food insecurity, housing insecurity, difficulties at home, identity issues, all of those cause children to not be able to focus on their education. And I like to think that their education is more than math and science and a whole bunch of history facts. It's about how to be a person and how to be a person with other people. So when kids have trouble focusing on those things, a lot of times it boils down to situations at home, stuff outside of school that interferes with their ability to focus on school.
You're spot on, Derek. And I mean, my experience with this is the birth to 5 again, but in thinking about what how children's brains learn, it is in relation to nurturing consistent interactions with caregivers. And the thing about social emotional learning, for example, so early childhood is a period of great opportunity, but also great vulnerability. And these early experiences set the stage for later health. The dimensions of that social emotional learning don't happen organically. They have to happen in relation. And so when we have, at least, you know, this extends all the way up, but in the pre-K space, staff who are very underfunded and overworked and undertrained, the interactions that they have with children are less likely to be those nurturing, brain building interactions. And as, you know, back to your point, Derek, or to close the loop on that, that is what they learn, is how to be a good human. It's self efficacy and persistence, and that they can do difficult things, that they can focus on tasks for a period of time, empathy, morality, communication, being able to communicate their own needs. That happens only in relation to their interactions with others. And so, yeah, there's so many layers of disparity there, right? If we don't have the right adults and adults who have the capacity, the training and the compensation, then that very clearly affects young children throughout the lifespan.
This is such a fantastic segue to our next question. As I've heard equitable access, social emotional learning come up. So we are going to get to quite possibly the most controversial question of the evening. So the context here from this question is many parents have expressed concerns and even hostility toward integrating the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI to those of us in education, social emotional learning, SEL, and critical race theory, CRT, into curriculum and instruction in public education institutions. And I say public education institutions because when we say schools, a lot of people think K through 12, but we're also talking about post-secondary institutions too. So the question is, how, if at all, have these principles been integrated into curriculum and instruction in public education institutions? And if they have, how are they benefiting or harming students? And I will leave this open to whoever wants to take the first swing at it.
So many people excited to jump in on that. Well, I think, you know, for me personally, I think it goes back again to like trying to find shared meaning of what these terms are. And I think it's been clear to me over the last year that these terms have been defined in a certain way to become polarizing or stigmatized. I think if we look at diversity in our communities, in our society, it's a good thing, right? You have to have diversity economically. Anybody who has a retirement fund isn't going to stick all their money into just one type of market. If we're talking about it from like an agricultural standpoint, obviously you want a lot of diversity in that industry. So it is interesting to me how in this particular, through this lens, it can be polarized and seen as something that is separate or other. I really liked what you said early on, Carrie, in regards to just even this conversation as being a conversation that you listen and try to understand. And if I'm speaking to some of the programming that the college puts together, that's really through the lens that we view it. For me personally, being a student of our educational system here, when I left the area, I was completely unprepared to work in a environment that was highly diverse. I took a position as in a managerial position with a library where I was overseeing 11 student workers, from graduate student workers, so we were roughly the same age, from all sorts of different backgrounds. Most of them were international students, but we also had people from other larger urban metropolitan areas, and I was wholly unprepared to have those interactions. And thankfully, I think what really helped me along was a willingness on their part to see my good intentions. So if I were approaching them in a way that was maybe was uncomfortable, they would bridge and say, oh, are you meaning this or this? Like, let's have a conversation about it. Let's talk about it. So I feel really fortunate, but from a career preparedness standpoint, I was working from a position of deficit. So for us, that's the lens that at least we look at our programming through, and specifically we're looking to build cultural competence, raise global awareness, and support social justice and ethical responsibility, and have those conversations. So they're conversations. We are not asking anyone to absorb a value that they don't personally align with. We had a speaker, Sammy Rangel, for our diversity symposium a few weeks ago, and one of the things that he discussed, he shared his background, and one of the things that resonated was like, who gets to share your story? Who gets to tell your story? Do you get to tell your story? Does someone else get to tell your story? And how are those social power dynamics affect that? And that's definitely something that I think is really important in public education here. So I see that as being a huge benefit to students. It can be uncomfortable sometimes hearing a story or a viewpoint that doesn't align with your worldview and makes you question that. But to me, that makes you, it improves your ability to think critically about things, to make good decisions, well-informed decisions. So I'm touching on it a little bit, and I want to allow other people, and if you need to hear more, let me know.
Yeah.
I can weigh in on this a little bit, or Carrie, go ahead.
Oh, please go.
I am sometimes asked by students in my world history class, when we talk about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation. I'm teaching that right now, so it's in my mind. And some kids will pop up and they'll say, you can't teach us religion. And I'll say, you're right. I'm not teaching you religion. I'm teaching you about religions. And I think that's one of the things that we face with these discussions. We talked about indoctrination in the first question at the pre-K levels. I don't know, but I remember when I was parenting my children, I wanted them to learn to share. I wanted them to learn to take turns. I don't know if those are leftist values, but my guess is that most people, kind of like supporting public education in Idaho, most people support those ideas, that they want their children to learn how to do that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are complicated topics. I don't know that I have had sufficient training to deal with all those questions at Lake City High School and in Coeur d'Alene School District. I know we have more work to do. In terms of social and emotional learning, that is becoming a dramatically more greater focus for us. We use QPR, suicide prevention. We use sources of strength. to teach kids to develop their various sources of strength, because every kid has something that can give them support in their life. Many kids have a lot of things. Some kids have very few, but we try to teach them to recognize those. The fun one for me as a social studies teacher is critical race theory. I've read a little bit about it. I have never been trained in critical race theory. I don't know why I would teach critical race theory in a high school classroom. This is a graduate level historical approach that is not appropriate for high school students. I think it's been demonized in the press or by portions of the press, that teachers are doing this even without knowing it. Oh, it's hard to do something very well if you don't know what you're doing. So I have concerns that this is fear mongering. But if we're going to teach American history, my area of expertise and the thing that I like, I am going to challenge what students think, where they come from, because if you don't, then they don't know that there are other ways to think about things, and they don't reflect on their understanding. And Brian, I think your experience moving to a much more ethnically diverse region illustrates kind of the vacuum that we in North Idaho live in. It's getting better, but we're nowhere near many urban areas and the diversity and the challenges that students and the public face. So I can address more questions, but that's probably enough for now.
Carrie, I definitely want you to jump in on SEL, because I know for sure you've got some stuff to say on that. But I just want to say real quick that what Derek says resonates, because critical thinking for students and challenging what they believe, preconceived notions, putting those to the test, getting those conversations going in a healthy way is so important. Because at the post-secondary level, when I was working for University of Idaho, my alma mater, I was constantly having conversations with professionals in the business community saying, we need students to critically think. We need more critical thinking. We need more cross-communication, cross-disciplinary skills. We have students that don't know how to talk to each other without offending each other. We need that. So I just want to say that that's a discussion that's going on in the business community in this area. I am hearing it, or was hearing it while I was still with University of Idaho, but I'm still hearing it. So I just wanted to insert that real quick and say thank you, Derek, for doing the work that you're doing and not being dissuaded by parents or whoever else in this area who doesn't think that you should be teaching students how to critically think. I do appreciate that you're still doing that. So Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, right along those lines, actually. And Derek, I think you made a good point in differentiating where it's really not helpful to paint a broad brush, or you really can't generalize what that curriculum looks like in any sphere. And so I can take it from an angle of the birth to 5 sphere, where if a provider or a parent or a teacher chooses to integrate a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, there's some basic definitions that are age appropriate. So diversity meaning differences, equity, giving everyone what they need to be successful, even if those things are not the same. Inclusion, the state of being included, valued, and respected, no matter what abilities you may or may not have. And this is a simplistic definition, which is helpful because in my experiences, preschoolers really don't have the capacity to talk about the means of production. So that's a little bit more of a conversation. But I think that what a lot of people mean when they refer to DEI in this negative way is maybe anti-racist or anti-bias education. And in this birth to 5 sphere, what it might look like is introducing books that feature Black, Indigenous, and people of color in many professions and community roles. Developmentally, babies start to notice differences in others by about 3 months of age, and it doesn't take very long for them to start articulating and asking questions about that. So when when children see themselves and others in what they read, they start to understand physical differences associated with race, and then giving them that respectful language to talk about those differences does build, it's all wound up in this SEL, the social emotional, but gives them, builds a positive sense of their own and others' identities. I think it's important to note that diversity, equity, and inclusion applies to a lot of things, such as children with disabilities. And that's something that we're hearing a lot from our community networks of childcare providers and early educators, is the challenges in their own skills of providing equitable learning experiences to children who may have a cognitive or a physical disability, or something that may be rooted in trauma, which we touched on before. It may be children who speak English as a second language. And again, I think it is super important to talk about trauma. Children who've experienced trauma and whose little brains are in a constant fight, flight, freeze loop impedes the development of their executive functions and their prefrontal cortex. And those executive functions are what employers want to see when they're 18 and 21. They want to see that they can understand and express themselves, that they can respectfully express differences. And planning and carrying out purposeful things. Another thing though too, I think that is important is I am also a parent who is part of the LGBTQ community, and when my son attended school, it became really apparent and relevant to me. I started to understand that he wasn't seeing any representations of different types of families or language that described different types of families that were beyond the heteronormative. And so that became a courageous conversation to have with him about how families are different, and that there's nothing wrong with his family, that there are a lot of ways to be a family, and communicating that with open-minded teachers so that they might think, oh, instead of saying just mom and dad, I might say parents, which helped him feel a sense of safety and belonging in his classroom community, which then primes him to be a better learner and not in a sort of excluded place. And acknowledging that that is a different experience than a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, but it is a personal experience that made it relevant. CRT, to my knowledge, is a bit advanced for the pre-K brain. Again, academic scholarship of race and US law is pretty high up there in that cognitive functioning. And then that social and emotional competence. I do think it's also worth asking the question, rather than how it might benefit or harm students, of asking maybe the question a different way of who benefits when students don't have this knowledge information, who benefits if we have a generation of children who become adults who don't know about the internment of Japanese American citizens in our own state, about the Aryan nations in our own community, the forced removal and forced assimilation of Indigenous children, and how that has affected generations of First Nations people here. Who stands to benefit when we have generations of community members that are unaware of that?
I appreciate you reframing that question, Carrie. The reason I originally wrote it as who's benefiting or is it harming students? And the reason I wrote it that way was because when we were at the school board meeting back in August, it was so clear to me that many, many parents were very convinced that social emotional learning, diversity and equity and inclusion were harming their students. They were dead convinced. I remember verbatim, somebody got up at the stand and said that equity is insidious. And I just was dying to ask him how, but it was not really the time that I could ask him. But yeah, reframing that question of who stands to benefit from preventing these discussions, that's very important too. Luke, you want to say something?
I just wanted to add something to Derek's comment and Derek's, defense of critical thinking. It seems to me that we would all do well, wherever we fall on the issue of critical race theory and what we think of it once we dig into the specifics of it, it would be extremely harmful if we turn against critical thinking itself. Oftentimes, at least the national figures, the figures on cable television who talk a lot about the danger of critical race theory, they present themselves as defenders of something called Western civilization, but the truth is that this whole notion of critical thinking isn't something that we came up with in the 1960s or something. This is something that's at the foundation of what's called Western civilization. You go back to what is often thought of as the foundation stone of Western civilization in the world of ideas. It's ancient Greek philosophy, Socrates saying famously that the unexamined life is not worth living. Right? That you are not being a full human being if you're not examining yourself, and if you're not examining your society and thinking critically. Socrates saying that the truly wise person isn't the person who knows a lot, it's the person who knows what they don't know. Right? This whole notion of intellectual humility, being able to understand that maybe the preconceived ideas you have about American history, maybe they're not right. Maybe they at least deserve some scrutiny. If we're not training, at the very least, if we're not training our 16, 17, 18-year-olds those basic concepts of critical thinking, we're doing an enormous amount of harm to them. We're taking away their ability to be competitive in the workforce, to be effective communicators with people who didn't grow up in the same conditions they grew up in. I think more importantly, though, we're taking away from them something that's just fundamental to being human. The experience of thinking critically about the big issues of our social political life. And I do worry that when you look at some of these laws being passed around the country, I think there was one that passed in maybe it was Texas, a different state, a couple weeks ago, that might have outlawed, or it might have discouraged any discussion of the founding fathers of the United States that does not present them as heroes. And as someone, I get a little animated about this because before I got into this organizing work, I was an academic teaching and writing about the American founding. And I have a great deal of admiration for nearly all of these figures. But it's clear, it's so clear, it seems, to anyone who takes seriously the history of our country, that one of the great challenges is learning how to grapple with the good and the bad together. And isn't that a skill set that we want to be able to pass on to young people?
Luke, there are so many elected officials that are not on this call that should be on this call to hear those words. In the interest of time, though, we are going to move on to the next question, which is important too when we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially along with SEL and CR. Whoops. And that is, this touches on mental health, which we've got to start having more of an active conversation about, especially in this area. So in context here, even though 1 in 5 youth in the US has a diagnosable mental health condition, Idaho has no requirements that schools provide mental health services for all students. Whether students have access to these in-school services largely depends on where they live. So the question here is the provision of these in-school services necessary? And if so, what can we do to ensure equitable access to in-school mental health services. And before I open this up for the panel, I just want to say real quick that I work as an indirect school support with counselors over in Washington State. And their work has, over these last 18 months, pushing 2 years now since we've been in a pandemic, has pivoted almost completely to mental health crises. I don't just mean a little bit of test anxiety, I mean mental health crises for their students. So when I come in and I'm trying to talk about college and career education and how to fill out your FAFSA, I mean, there's students that are struggling just emotionally to get through their days. So just be thinking about that. And that's no different over in Washington as it is over here in Idaho. Students are all struggling right now, especially, I think more than ever in recent memory. So Derek, you look like you wanna take this one.
Let's see, am I on? Okay. There is no question that we are dealing with more and more students struggling with mental health issues. But I guess I wanted to go back to the last question for a minute, because one of the solutions to that struggle with mental health is school. If we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm going to have fewer mental health challenges if I've got a community around me that supports me and where I feel like I'm doing something productive and useful that benefits me and benefits other people. So accomplishing inclusion is essential for students in order to help grapple with some of those mental health challenges. The foundation is the concept of equity, which is not equality where everybody gets the same thing. It's equity where everybody gets what they need, or as much of what they need as we can provide. And the thing that makes school interesting for students is diversity. Most students who are engaged and feel included like to grapple with tough questions and things that, I mean, it doesn't matter what the content is. It can be a construction class, it can be an art project, it can be an English thing where you're interpreting a poem. If you are challenged by the work that you're doing, you're going to feel better about what you're doing, and it's going to feel more productive and more useful. And that comes from diversity. A diversity of experiences, a diversity of contents, a diversity of people and perspectives. And so I think big picture, funding is the big picture answer to this question. But we also have to be doing all the things in education to make that a safe place for students so that we can head off some of the mental health issues.
I also want to point to educator mental health too, administrator mental health too. This is all very important. If you've got educators who feel like they are adequately resourced, paid sufficiently, happy with what they're doing, happy with what they're given, typically the classroom environment is going to be happier. And it's going to be emotionally better for students as well too. So I don't want you to think that I was leaving out educators or administrators or support staff as well too.
Carrie, I'll just say quickly that when we first launched our ballot initiative to increase funding for K-12 education, it was before the pandemic, and we then had to shut down when the pandemic broke out because it literally became illegal to collect signatures for a few months. But we then relaunched the initiative, and we had to draft a new version of it. And one of the only, I think, 2 or 3 small changes that we made, although it's pretty significant, is that we added in the list of things that the money could go towards, we added counselors and school psychologists, because we just heard over and over again when we were collecting signatures the first time, especially from people with a lot of experience in the schools, that you've got to have, that's right up there at the top in terms of needs. And I've certainly since come to believe that.
One way, may not directly answer the question, but I think one way that we can continue to promote that is by looking to models like the community school strategies, where the school is a hub for family resources. And I think this also links into that sort of that what creates the magic sauce for go-on rates is a holistic wraparound support of children and their families. And so the community school strategy uses different types of frameworks to develop these resources around the school as a hub, which I've seen play out in really great ways here in our own districts. So finding ways to provide concrete support to parents when they need it and that it's accessible, it's on-site or co-located, providing opportunities for them to develop more knowledge about parenting and child development, how to help their kids, developing resilience, which is kind of that key ingredient to mental health is developing resilience. And then there's other areas of that too, but social emotional competence, again, always coming back to that keyword. But it is a challenge because we don't want to put it all on schools. It is a sort of a community-wide obligation or responsibility. But I think that is a way that that ideally we can increase the access to mental health supports and those other tangential things that play into mental health is by wrapping around schools and not saying it's all on you to do it, school counselors, in addition to your career counseling, et cetera, but to use those schools as a trusted hub of resources and information, and also understanding that it limits the runaround and going back and forth that families may see that may be an obstacle to accessing mental health or other supports.
I think it'll be interesting too at the North Idaho College. They've used some CARE funds to dedicate to having telehealth opportunities for students and hopefully capturing some of that data to provide support for future funding for those types of services.
All right, and speaking of NIC, we got another fun question for you guys. So in light of the recent termination of former North Idaho College President Rick McLennan, what do you believe influences these decisions, and how are these decisions either helpful or harmful to public education institutions and to the communities in Idaho? And I don't just mean former President Rick McLennan's termination. I mean everything that's going on with school boards right now too. I'm seeing recalls all over the place. Who is really making these decisions and what is influencing these decisions? What is really the driving force behind all of this? And is this helpful? Is this harmful? Is this democracy at work? What is it? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I can speak to something I've heard a lot, and specifically at Board of Trustees meetings the last few years is the college reflecting community values. And I've had conversations with people trying to understand what community values mean. Again, I guess I'm sort of rooted in language and shared meaning, specifically at the last board meeting where President McLennan's contract was terminated. There was a community member who approached Trustee Barnes and said, "Thank you for finally having this college reflect our community values." So I approached that person afterward and said, you know, it's hurtful for us in the community who are educators doing our job supporting students and sort of being demonized. I said, how do you sort of see us as not representing community values. And this individual said, well, it's hurtful to me that I can't send my kids to NIC because of the liberal indoctrination. And I said, well, is that something that's happened? They were here and they experienced that. And she dismissed herself from the conversation, said, thank you very much, goodbye. And I think that's the hard thing, is we can't have a shared conversation to find some understanding. So for me, again, if I'm trying to think through a situation, I'm wanting to understand people's positions. I'm not relying upon hearsay and fear mongering. I'm going to try to have those conversations, and I think that you're seeing this manifest in the community. I have a colleague who was at Costco wearing NIC gear, and a woman approached him and said, we're going to shut you down, you communist institution, you're going to be gone. And he was so taken aback, and he said, I think you're misinformed, and walked away. But I think there's a strong feeling in the community. If you are an educator, at least at NIC, I personally remove things from my car that have NIC logos on them, because I am sort of fearful that I will be targeted and as painted as a communist in our community, when in reality, we are just trying to support students. We are not bringing in our own political ideologies and representing them and asking people to align with those values. So I see that as highly problematic. And I think the role of the Board of Trustees at NIC is to, determine the broad general policies of the college. And to me, those don't align with political ideology. That public education should be neutral in that sense. But I will let others jump in here.
I'll just give a quick comment. Brian, it's heartbreaking to hear you talk that way about the perceptions of North Idaho College, at least among some members of the community. I myself did fairly well in high school, even though I was, had a lot of chaotic, experiences as a child, and didn't necessarily always have a very stable kind of childhood. I went off to college out of state and found it extremely difficult to kind of get on. And I dropped out after my first semester, and I came back to Sandpoint and didn't know what I was going to do. I moved to Coeur d'Alene, moved into a room in an apartment with a few old friends who weren't very serious about school, as at least not quite as much as I was at the time. So there were a lot of challenges there, but I went to North Idaho College, and it completely turned me around. It gave me an environment that I could experiment in. It was somewhere in between college and high school for me, like in terms of the small class sizes. And I then, I think 2.5 years later, I was enrolled in a PhD program. I took incredible courses there. I took logic. I learned logic in a philosophy course for the first time in my life. I took ethics with Michelle Lippert, who's on this call actually, and who's here. I took a whole range of courses. I also did work study. I can't remember what it's called, but a program where I was doing note taking for students with certain disabilities that made it difficult for them to sometimes take in all the information in their courses. It was a completely life-changing experience for me, and it was a social safety net. And the idea that it could possibly be smeared as some kind of like harm to the community is just, it is heartbreaking to hear about that. And it certainly didn't feel like that in 2005 when I was there. Didn't feel that way. Maybe some people thought that the campus life was maybe a little bit more liberal or something like that, but it wasn't a great controversy. As from nothing, I don't remember anything like that, and I can't help but think it's just opportunism. It's people looking for a fight, people looking for a way to divide the community. And again, I mean, I would never want to discourage any kind of civil conversation. And I would never want to even hint that, you know, everyone doesn't have some kind of at least possibly have some kind of legitimate concern. But the solution is always having conversations, having real conversations about it, and actually listening to one another. And if we can't do that, then we're really in trouble. The little bit of hope that I have is that it seems like we're still at the beginning of this phase. It seems like there could be a lot more people, and not just in Kootenai County, but around the state where similar things are happening in different communities. There could be a real awakening to the danger that these institutions are in, or that they're facing, and people could really start to rally around these institutions. I certainly hope that will happen, and it's got to be people from all political stripes. It's got to be people from both parties, all different backgrounds, ages, walks of life, and I'm hopeful that we can make that happen.
Thanks, Luke.
Well said.
I would also just, Sherry asked, you know, how can we combat some of this? And I think Lori mentioned some of that too, both on the conversation here. And you know, some of the places that I've discovered where people are learning about these things, and you know, the way it's described in these toolkits to combat CRT in K through 12 and post-secondary, it can be really frightening sounding, right? Specifically in their toolkit for CRT, Citizens Renewing America, it has a whole outline like how will you be attacked, and in a paragraph it reads, as previously discussed, the way CRT and CSJ, which is this critical social justice, which is not a term I've ever heard of, operate as a takeover ideologies. Proponents don't care how they win as long as they win. They are not trying to win an academic debate. They are attempting to socially replace you. Read that line again. It says they are not trying to win an academic debate. They are trying to socially replace you, which also feeds into other issues that we have in our region, which is, you know, replacement theory. So there's a lot of overlapping issues at play with this. And I think, again, when you have an environment that's so charged, I really am not sure how you try to find shared meaning on these things other than having really meaningful one-on-one conversations in your community. I think probably Luke and everyone affiliated with Reclaim Idaho could speak to that. But circling back a bit to the previous couple questions ago, I think, you know, along with this sort of literature, there is this idea that that we are all the same and we can't talk about our differences. But as Carrie was mentioning, those differences are really important for representation. We don't all start in the same place, and it's really important to understand that when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. In the neighborhood that I lived in Oakland, California, it was very low income. Man, it was a great neighborhood. I got to know a lot of people from different walks of life in that neighborhood. But when things got bad, they got really bad. There was one day where kids woke up to a man who had been stabbed to death and left in the bushes just a block not a block, like a house, literally a house. And then across the street, there was a church there from our place. And the first people to discover his body were kids on their way to school. So kindergartners, first grade, second grade. And to say that that doesn't have an impact on a child and how if they feel safe in their own neighborhood, if they feel safe in school with lockdowns every day. I think that's a really important thing to understand when you're talking about social issues, that they not only apply to our community, but they apply to the larger community, our United States, right? So how are all those things interconnected? So thanks for your comments, Luke.
All right, and we will get to our last question here. Since we were talking about NIC, and this one is really close to my heart because I have been doing work in that college and career sphere for the last couple of years now. And it's by 2025, 60% or more of jobs in Idaho will require a post-secondary credential from an institution like NIC. Right now, about 42% of Idaho's workforce has such a credential. So what can we do to improve the go-on rate to institutions like NIC, to apprenticeship programs, to universities, to ensure robust economic growth here in Idaho? Because heaven knows it is growing like crazy in this area. And we need to have jobs available for students who are prepared to take them, but we also have to be preparing those students to take those jobs so that there is a pool of talent. So how do we improve this? And we are not the only state that's struggling with this. Like I mentioned, I now work in Washington State, and we really struggle even pre-pandemic trying to get students to even consider something, apprenticeship program, a community college.
So we had started looking at this because every few years this comes up again in conversations about education, is the go-on rate. And for United Way, looking at the indicators of going on to some post-secondary education or training, a strong indicator was high school graduation. So kind of working backwards from there, which is typically how we approach the work, is are there upstream interventions that we can get into to change the trajectory moving forward, rather than, kind of trying to catch up later. And so looking at interventions to increase high school graduation, found research and communities that were having really good success with introducing middle school youth to career and education options at the middle school level. But then looking backwards even from that, it became third grade reading levels. And if children are reading proficiently at third grade, they're much more likely to graduate high school. So then how do we get them to third grade reading levels? Well, a big indicator of that is school readiness, entering kindergarten ready to learn. So how do we determine, how do we ensure that children are entering school ready to learn? Well, it starts at birth. And so that's sort of how we got to where we are, is just continuing to work backwards and upstream. So I think that's one of the ways that as a community, we found a lot of support and a lot of people leaning into an understanding and a resonance of that, that this learning happens continuously and in a lot of ways, and throughout the whole community, not only in schools or early education, but in libraries and in neighborhoods and parks. And I mean, it takes a whole community. And so there's that one, but then also sort of what we talked about before a little bit in that mental health sphere is wraparound support and community engagement in investment in the success of every child and every family, I think is really critical to that, because it's not enough for just teachers to be working on this, or counselors or the student themselves, but this whole family engagement and support, so that when families are, I really dread the day that my son has some challenging math homework, because that 100% was not my strong point, and it was a huge block for me. So I need those resources so that I can continue to be an educational resource for my kid. And I know I'm not the only parent out there that's like, I don't know how to do algebra anymore. What is Pythagorean? And so providing a lot of opportunities and low entry opportunities, right? So that it's not out of the norm for parents to be coming to the school or to a library or whatever and receiving that support, where it's just so saturated in the community that you don't have to ask for it, it's just there. I think is a really important way, and just a broader lens of looking at how our policy and our systems and our environments are working together to promote that lifelong learning, those happy, healthy, engaged students and humans throughout the lifespan. It's not a single institution or entity that can do it. It's not just one intervention. It is so holistic. It is this, this social ecological model, which is why I think conversations like this are so helpful for me in taking all these notes of like, oh, I can think of 20 parents who use our scholarship program who could benefit from this tendril of information that I got, because it's not just their little kids that need this support and education. The majority of families who are accessing our scholarships are single parents who have at most some college, not a completed degree, and that has affected their income prospects, and so that continues to have that trickle effect. That's my input. It's my more than 2 cents.
I just want to throw in there real quick that when I was going through middle school and high school, and I'm sure things have changed a little bit since then as we've had an influx of a lot of out-of-staters in this area, but when I was going through school, I remember having a lot of conversations with my friends. We were starting to have those conversations, and I remembered how many parents did not have a post-secondary credential, and there were actually conversations being had with the kids about why they shouldn't even consider going on because of student loan debt, and it was just going to be a pit for them, and it was not going to help them in the long run, and that was it, conversation tabled. I remember those conversations were happening. Whereas conversely, I'm a first-gen student, and my parents were like, you have no choice, you are going on to college. So it was just such a weird kind of a polarity going on there between, it seemed like there were like half the students that were definitely going to go. They were really excited about that, about the prospect of some kind of post-secondary education. And then there were the other half that were just like, nope, not even having those conversations, shut the door on it before we were even close to our senior year in high school. And I'd be interested to hear, from Derek or anyone else, is that still the same? Has that changed? I'd be fascinated to know. I really would.
Many of those conversations are still happening. Some students with support have a direction and a plan. Students with less support have less awareness of what the options are and what the possibilities are. The question that you asked originally was, what do we do about this disparity between the jobs that are needed and the fact that we're not producing students with those credentials? This is where me as an ardent capitalist comes out, and I'll tell you, the market will solve the problem. If Idaho doesn't have enough qualified people will come to Idaho to take jobs that are higher paid and have better quality of life. That won't be good for the native Idahoans, but it will solve the problem if we're just looking at that part of the problem. I believe in the economics of capitalism and the forces that function there. They work. The challenge is, what do we do about the kids who are here, who are trying to get an education, or not trying very hard to get an education? What happens to them? And I will dump the responsibility in large part on my profession. We need to keep kids engaged and involved and recognizing what's important. They need to feel like they're included. They need to feel like what they're doing is valuable. the challenge that I think we face, and Carrie, you nailed this with your story, is that we have a portion of the parent population that is afraid of that success, that potential for success, that is afraid of the risk of the expense of college. And we have a challenge there with the cost of college for families. So NIC is a fabulous institution. My daughter did a lot of her work there before finishing up at BSU. And I have lots of former students that have gone through programs there. And I think one of the things that we're doing well with K-Tech and with the nursing and automotive programs at NIC is we are feeding the need of those students that may not be academically inclined. And the question is whether we keep making productive investments in those kinds of programs to ensure that students have that inclusion and that opportunity.
If I could jump in there and disagree in a very friendly way, I think a little bit, Derek, with your statement that you know, a great deal of the responsibility falls on the educators for, you know, getting kids enthusiastic about going on and such. I agree. I mean, I agree with the essence of what you're saying, but I also think that we need, whether it's in Kootenai County or around the state, we need hundreds and hundreds and thousands more ordinary citizens outside of the education world who are advocates for education. That's part of what we're trying to do with our work with Reclaim Idaho, is not just win an initiative, but to get people organized all around the state to really help cultivate thousands of new advocates for education. Some of them will be teachers, some of them will be parents, some of them will be neither, but all of them will be advocates for education. And it's so important if we want to see our educational institutions survive, and if we want to see communities really buy into them and you know, encourage their children to attend them and to work hard in them. We cannot take public education for granted as an institution that will just survive on its own, because it's not that. It never has been that. When I think about North Idaho College, I think about the community college movement in America, one of the great movements of our history. Every country, even a lot of rich countries, do not have colleges like NIC all over the country. We have an incredible system of community colleges, junior colleges, two-year colleges. Most of them are woefully underfunded, but it took an enormous amount of advocacy and hard work and organizing and ordinary people standing up and speaking up to even get those institutions established in the first place. And the truth is, it took an enormous movement and a whole lot of advocacy to get public high school established in the first place. People think that, you know, public high school is like, you know, gravity or something. It just exists. No, people had to establish it. And it used to be an extremely controversial thing that taxpayers would fund other kids, you know, high schools for other kids who weren't their own kids. But we have it, and we have it all over the country, but it won't, there's no reason to think it will last if in anything close to what we've cherished in our history if we don't defend it. So that's just one, you know, one thing that I want to communicate is that we have to become advocates in our daily lives for these institutions. If we really value them as much as I think we do, we've got to speak up for them and stand up for them at every chance we get.
Got to make it so Brian can put his NIC stuff back on his car. The NIC sweatshirts at Costco.
I have so much gear, I have so many thoughts about this too in regards to if, you know, we're thinking through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, I think, you know, we live in a unique area that is booming here. So a lot of male students, you know, I think see opportunity in construction, that sort of thing. They can leave high school and make a very good wage without, you know, going through higher education and getting a degree that way. And you know, you see that gap, that gender gap widening of who is enrolled at a community college. It's not just here, it's nationally. So you see more women, and that's probably partially due to the wage gap as well, right? So that's a component. I think we're also looking at, if you're looking at demographics in this area where they're projected to be, we're seeing a huge jump. I was just doing a presentation for a psychology of business course the other day, and looking at census projections for 65 and older, and that group is growing at a projected rate that is almost twice any other group in this area. So so are you creating more jobs to support that demographic while they're here? There's also like senior care and in-home care assistants that are already seem to be deficient in this area. Are we going to have new jobs that support those too? And I think the other component too, and I can speak to this myself, part of the reason my wife and I left too is because you could make twice as much somewhere else in a more urban environment. That wasn't the only factor, but how do we, once we get students into our higher education system, we educate them, how do we retain them in that way too? And I think creating a community that reflects everyone's values is a really important component of that.
I think it's important to point out what you said about the demographics too, and how they're changing and how they're graying, if you will, in this area. And I have talked to some folks who are part of that demographic who don't understand that they too are stakeholders in education. Someone's got to provide healthcare for them. Someone might have to provide transportation for them. So, you know, there are a lot of things that go into it. And I think it's important. It speaks exactly to what Luke says, to create advocates from all groups, from all demographics, who are advocates for education, because it extends well beyond just the students. It affects everybody. And if we don't have those jobs filled, those wonderful nursing jobs that NIC does such a great job educating those students, then we're going to have run into some real problems here in the very near future. I appreciate so much all of you for all of your responses and spending the time doing this. I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica real quick. I think she has something she'd like to say as we wrap this up.
Well, I do think we have a couple moments to address a couple questions that were in the chat, and I am going to combine questions that were both from Corey and Florine. Why has funding eroded so significantly? Who are legislators listening to? And that was from Corey. Florine asked, who stands to benefit when the legislature turns down funds and doesn't prioritize education? Now you might have to have some short and sweet responses here, panelists, but if we could take maybe up to 5 minutes and discuss that.
I could try to give the shortest, sweetest, I don't know about sweet, but history of the funding problem. On my reading, it really does go back to the 1990s when the Idaho legislature ceased to be a balanced legislature with two parties. And this isn't to say anything partisan, but it is to say that when two parties have to compete with one another, they tend to they compete for votes. And that means they listen a lot more to what the vast majority of people actually need. And when there's one party, generally politicians end up responding to the primary electorate, which is a much smaller electorate. And that electorate tends to be, in our history at least, a lot more, it's ends up being, you know, taken over by divisive issues and, you know, big controversies that have very little to do oftentimes with the kind of bread and butter needs of people. So ever since the state of Idaho became a one-party state, you've seen a decline in commitment to education. And then in 2006, there was a massive tax shift that foisted a whole lot more of the burden onto local property taxpayers and made school funding a lot more unequal across districts, as Derek was describing earlier. And then in 2008, you had the financial crash and the Great Recession that led to education just being cut to the bone. And then we gradually recovered a little bit, but the final thing I'll say is that one of the saddest parts of the history in my mind, it was actually the last 6 years or so when there was significant reinvestment, but generally the legislature and the political establishment in our state patted themselves on the back a whole lot for that. And they really told themselves that they had solved the problem by just kind of reinvesting a little bit in education, when really they needed to do about 4 times what they did in order to really get us back to anywhere close to where we needed to be.
Luke has done a nice job there. The other thing that I would say is it does come down to the legislature, and our legislature doesn't have an education caucus. We don't have a bipartisan group of legislators working together to advocate for education. I think your point about, Luke's point about the legislators who control the legislature are patting themselves on the back for doing a little bit, but they don't have anybody pointing out to them that they're not doing enough. And I don't know what the solution is other than more balance in the legislature.
And I wanted to add to the other part of the question, I think, Jessica, was who stands to benefit when legislatures turn down that funding. And I don't know if that's a blanket like a answer that we could make, but I do think that at least from what I've observed in the last couple of years is a lot of efforts being taken to connect the dots between how education is connected to the friendly business environment and sort of that ethos of Idaho. And I'll point to a couple of players there, the Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children, working with the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry to really learn and seek to understand what employers' concerns are and being able to connect the dots for both working parents today and the future workforce of tomorrow. And then my colleague Mark dropped a link in there that is the Idaho Business for Education legislature's scorecard, which is a really useful tool. It's really helpful to look through that and kind of understand. And then, you know, I think it's not an answer to the question specifically, but I think it might provide a launching point to understand more about where our local legislators are coming from, what they care about, and where their priorities are, and find ways to bridge those priorities to speak the language. I definitely think for me personally and professionally, not backing down from promoting equitability and a strong standard of education, and not backing down from DEI education and anti-bias education. But I think in order to do the best by our citizens, and especially for our youngest and most vulnerable citizens that don't have a voice, it really is a practice, again, for me to figure out ways to bridge those priorities so that we can find common ground and understand where our priorities align. So just thinking through that for me was pointing to the surprising advocate that we found in the Idaho Association for Commerce and Industry in this, with PG funding.
Thanks, Carrie. And I would also add that I think, kind of piggybacking on what Luke said, when you when you really only have one party. I think it's really problematic too when our legislators feel like they don't even need to take questions from us or make themselves available for open forums or debates. To me, that shows a lack of interest in wanting to have a real conversation and include everyone in that conversation. I recently looked at party affiliation numbers, because one thing that I've heard from people is, let's keep Idaho red. And, a lot of liberals are moving into this area. And just interestingly, looking at voter affiliation numbers from 2014, we had roughly like 70,000 registered voters. And then in 2021, just over 100,000. And what we saw with in crunching those numbers just quickly was we had in 2014 about 61% of those were unaffiliated, and now you're down to like 28% that are unaffiliated, and you really see a lot of those numbers shift over from 31% being affiliated with the Republican Party in 2014 to 58%, and you saw roughly the same adjustment with Democratic numbers from 6% to roughly 12%. So definitely something that you're just seeing nationally is more of a people affiliating with a particular political identity and just voting across party lines without really wanting to understand or listen. So thank you, Civic Engagement Alliance, about providing an opportunity to really kind of speak to what candidates are representing in our community and how to best educate ourselves in voting for our own interests and our community's interests as well, because those things aren't mutually exclusive, right?
And if I could just, we're going to be closing out here, but there was a couple things I just wanted to add. I first want to give a big round of applause to my co-organizer, Carrie Morrison. She, I thought, did an excellent job. We were meeting and having discussions on what this conversation was going to look like, and both of us felt strongly that we needed to have a holistic conversation, something that interconnects all of these various issues, because they are interconnected. And I thought that the way that all the panelists here today really showed that, quite beautifully, and we really were able to help dive into some really important issues that really hasn't had a platform yet in our local community. So thank you all for speaking up about these issues. It's really important. This dialogue, we had originally hoped to have this be live at the public library. We had that reserved and everything. And there was a couple of reasons why we changed. And one, it was because the escalated cases of COVID. And anyone that knows me as an organizer, I just can't have it on my heart or soul to if anyone ever fell ill because of something I organized. And two, the second reason is that, Carrie referred to the August meeting we went to, but I went to others. I went to other school board meetings. I went to the NIC meeting. I went to a community forum that was held by the schools. And they were some of the most scariest, most unsettling spaces I felt like I had ever been in before. And this rise of incivility that is being reported, in so many different ways locally, it's really concerning. And I think that hopefully, I wish that I could have had all the people that are in attendance live with us, because you all have something valuable to bring as well. But I promise one day we'll bring everyone together live and dialogue in the future. But thank you everyone for being a part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you everybody so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to our panel. This was fantastic. One of the best conversations that I've ever been a part of. Thank you all so much.
Thank you to everybody who came and joined and listened.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.